Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
Hi, Damien. I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
Sometimes I really can't with you. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And you, crazy man, are up this week.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table today?
Well, I'm bringing, finally,
Yes.
white property, black trespass, racial capitalism, and the religious function of mass criminalization by Andrew Krinks.
Yes.
It was published a few months ago in August 2024. And I should also probably say that we received this book from the publisher for review on our podcast here that we're doing right now after Andrew reached out on social media. So thanks for this copy of the book.
Yes,
to
thank you.
NYU Press. And, thanks, Andrew, for writing such an in-depth exploration of the creation of and maintenance of racial capitalism in the West and how mass criminalization, including police and prisons, are rooted in religion.
Yeah.
And it's not really something I had thought much about.
Not at all.
Before now. We'll just jump right in. I have a lengthy introduction to this,
Okay.
and then we'll jump in.
Yeah.
So this book explores the way that religion has set up our systems of settler colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and how those systems of control then established a manifestation of that control, which was mass criminalization through policing and prisons and other stuff related to that. So Krinks establishes that the concept of white property is essentially a form of sacredness.
Yes.
Where people owning property, white people in particular, that's a sacred thing in the United States. And black trespass is therefore an invasion of that sacredness, which ultimately requires a violent response.
Right.
And so he says in the introduction, quote, "The term trespass also conveys the out-of-placeness that many forms of religion interpret as disorderly disruption of the sacred," which I thought was a really eloquent way to put that and a nice way to illustrate that what that trespass really means.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say about the book itself, "As I endeavor to show, mass criminalization and all the forms of criminalization that precede it is a manifestation of the religious dynamic captured in the oppositionality between white property and black trespass. From Muslim ministers to public enemy, black folks have been saying for a long time that white man's heaven is a black man's hell. And it is the police power of criminalization that makes it so. In form and function alike, criminalization constitutes a religion."
Yes.
And, Andrew Krinks almost relentlessly demonstrates this throughout the book.
Yes.
Just how much patriarchal white supremacist capitalism established its boundaries throughout history and then reinforces those boundaries with mass criminalization, with policing, with prisons. There is a lot in this book.
Yes.
I have so many highlights. I did not copy all of them over into my notes doc where I plan things out, but I checked it out and I have about 11 pages of quotes from the book.
Wow.
Of things that I was like, ooh, I could talk about this.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot here, and I don't know how we're going to talk about a lot of it.
Yeah.
But where do you want to start? Let's, I guess, scratch the surface.
Yeah,
at
seriously.
least.
All we're going to do is scratch the surface because there was so much in this book. And I agree. I also had so many things that I highlighted in this book. And I also agree, I think it would be fascinating to, tomorrow go and talk to somebody about this concept of religion and its impact and its influence on mass incarceration really around the world. And I feel like this book gave me some ability to do that. But yeah, I definitely had not thought about this topic at all before we got introduced to this book. And this was a really fascinating book. You said, Krinks was in-depth, often an in-depth analysis, and that's spot on. It was really thorough and really thorough with all of his examples and histories that he offered in this book and his analysis around how religion has shaped the creation of white supremacy, really, and influenced really all of its tentacles and all of the many elements of our criminal punishment system. And so, there was so much that I learned through all of this book. And I feel like I learned something in every single chapter,
Yeah,
which is an incredible thing to get from a book, and another reason why I love doing this podcast.
Yeah.
So one of the things I pulled from the introduction to the book that I wanted to chat about was this, quote, "Modern police and prisons emerged over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, primarily as a means of producing and maintaining colonial racial capitalist order by controlling Black, Indigenous, and other dispossessed peoples, whom the state and ruling classes defined as sources of intolerable social disorder. Even as police and prisons have evolved over time, this core function, social control of racialized and dispossessed peoples defined as criminal threats, has remained central." And I really appreciated that analysis. And I think building on that, I think one of the biggest tenets of this book, or in this book, I should say, is this idea that policing and the criminal punishment system are not designed to keep us safe.
Yeah.
And there's so much that's caked into the existence and purpose and function of policing and the larger criminal punishment system that has really, I think, shaped how we as people have come to understand one another, how we have come to interact with one another, how we care for one another. And I also think it's also shaped how we have come to understand safety and what that is and what it looks like and so on. And so to me, this book really beautifully illuminates how messed up our understanding and our vision of safety is, thanks to these systems, right? That again aren't designed to keep us safe.
Yeah, I think that's the main, I think, tenet of the book is the way that religion shaped how white supremacy developed and how it shaped and legitimized the development of capitalism in before then. Like it just shaped all these things and then continued to reinforce them. And yeah,
and it was so pervasive, right, that it became a part of our system and our structures and our interactions and everything that we do in that way.
And it continues to today. There's a chapter, or there's a quote from later on. I don't remember. I'm going to paraphrase it. Yeah. But they talk about a version of the Bible that's been produced over the last few decades and is relatively new, but it really is designed or is written for police and their families, and talks about police as servants of God. And so the religion aspect continues in different ways, right? Like it's continued to evolve in how one reinforces the other.
And I think that's in that same chapter that talks about some of the like scriptures are even imprinted on police buildings and carved into statues in front of police stations and onto the walls of police stations. I mean, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah, just different translations of scripture into taking meaning from it.
Yes.
That, we're talking, this means police. And
yeah.
Like,
wait.
I don't, whoever wrote that didn't exist at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just interesting.
Yes.
So I'm going to jump around here a little bit and talk about chapter 4.
Okay.
So criminalization and deification is the name. And Krinks really digs into how patriarchal whiteness and its elements were deified while creating methods of criminalizing those who didn't live up to the standards of patriarchal whiteness. He says, quote, "Unsurprisingly, many of those who were already dispossessed by privatization in early modernity refused to be exploited through wage labor, a refusal that they enacted either through impromptu or organized acts of resistance, or through simply opting to wander and beg for means of subsistence instead. Those who did not properly submit to the allegedly God-ordained task of laboring to produce other people's wealth, the state criminalized, captured, punished, and treated as a criminal threat to the social order itself, all for trying to survive a condition into which the theologically legitimated greed of landowners and legislators forced them. In these ways, those who were dispossessed by early agrarian capitalism were stuck between a rock and a hard place, forced to choose between an unprotected existence at the disposal of exploitative bosses or a life of vagrancy criminalized through punishment, forced labor, torture, imprisonment, or death. The dispossession that the state, in coordination with wealthy landowners, created through mass theft and displacement with one hand, it exploited and criminalized with the other. The birth of racial capitalism and the birth of modern police and prisons constitute not two histories but one, The dual task of enforcing capitalist dispossession and managing its outcomes gave us police and carceral power as we know them today. And in this book, Andrew goes through some of the history of enclosure in the United Kingdom and across Europe, and how that was tied into huge shifts in how people related to one another and the land and employment.
Yes.
And that led to so many people becoming displaced and no longer having a place to live or make a living. And then ultimately those forces in the UK and Europe were expanded upon as patriarchal whiteness continued and turned to colonization and to enslavement. They took the structures and the concepts of dispossession, of displacement that already existed through enclosure of the commons, and applied them with violence to Africans and indigenous people on this continent. And so it was really fascinating to read through some of this history.
Yes.
Of how it started, not necessarily here on these shores, but in the United Kingdom, and how they also talk about, or he talks about how the word race kind of evolved, and they used race in these days of the early days of enclosure to talk about like the poorer races, and it was a class term, right?
Yes.
It wasn't necessarily about skin color. It was about a group of people. And so you take that concept and then apply people who physically look different,
Right.
and it just they already had a structure to then apply to, oh, we want to exploit these people, we want to do this, and this might be the best way to do it, right?
Absolutely.
And so it evolved out of the things that already existed.
Yeah. This was a really, like you say, fascinating chapter. I mean, there was a lot in this, and I really like the quote that you pulled. I think one of the things it makes me think about is, when we're talking about the influence of religion on mass incarceration and the patriarchy and white supremacy, is that it's everywhere in this. It's on all sides of this. You think the quote you said, God ordained task. Yeah. I mean, there was the work that was done to move people and take land away from indigenous folks and folks who were in place was a God ordained task. And then you criminalize those people because of that religion, that belief that, you can do that. And then, you punish those people, right? And that is a God ordained that you have to do. And so it's just at every stage it exists. And that to me was the fascinating piece of, wow, how we're using religion to justify the actions at every single stage.
Yeah.
Was mind-blowing to sort of think about.
Yeah, and it felt like using religion, but it also felt like more than that, right? It felt like it didn't necessarily feel like, oh, I'm white supremacist capitalist. Not that they would have called themselves that at the time,
right?
But this is my belief system, and I'm going to apply it via religion.
Yes.
It was the evolution of ideas within religion that then reinforced. Like
yes.
they were reinforcing each other. They were in a mutual kind of relationship around the development of these ideas and concepts, and ultimately violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump back to the first chapter of the book, and I think it connects to what you were talking about here. The first chapter was called Patriarchal Whiteness and Private Property. And so this was a bit more of, obviously this was an early chapter, so there was a lot of sort of concept building in this first chapter. This one was all about the origins of criminalization and how it was intertwined with Euro-Christian settler colonialism and patriarchal whiteness and racial capitalism. And there's so much in this that I learned about the history of the connections between whiteness and property and the religious and existential underpinnings of those things to what we have been conditioned to know and to believe to be the social order of things, even to this day. And it's wild, I think, to think about that and the power that racial capitalism, for instance, has on our society. And so Krinks says this in chapter 1, quote, "Where there is European colonialism, there is also racial capitalism. Much like colonialism, capitalism is, at its most basic level, a system of hierarchical social relations that generates wealth for a few through the dispossession and exploitation of many, including the earth itself. When capitalism emerged in Europe over the course of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries out of the feudal order that preceded it, It did so in and through the forced displacement of masses of people from land and thus from their means of subsistence, as lords and others landlords enclosed, combined, and privatized common lands in order to expand their wealth. At its most elementary level, the premise and purpose of capitalism is the narrow accumulation of greater and greater wealth, and increasing wealth, by definition, requires dispossession and exploitation. Without the private possession of land and other means of production, and without a class of propertyless people who survive by producing wealth for others in exchange for a wage, there is no capitalism. Mm-hmm. And, I think taking this point a step further, given that this has been the way of life for centuries, and the criminal punishment system was designed to uphold this racial capitalism, this social order, it just made me think about the movements and the fights for abolition and social justice, and the cancel debt movement, and why those things have been so important.
Yeah, because it's all, you can see when you're able to pull back some of the curtain on all of these things, you see how connected they are.
Right.
Right. And we've talked about this before when we talked about debt. It's a means of social control.
Yes.
In a different way than other more obvious forms of social control. It's not inherently, or it's not violent in your face.
Right.
There's a different form of control that it exerts over you.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you can see that they're all connected when you pull back the layer, especially when you think about, like this book does, when it dives into sort of the origins of some of these things.
Yes.
You really start to see, so if this existed here, right, like this is connected this way, you just start to see it all.
Absolutely.
It connects the dots.
Yep.
So, again, jumping around, I'm going to get to the 5th chapter here.
Okay.
It's called Measuring Salvation in Chains and Corpses.
Ooh.
Yeah. And this is a reference to an open letter that James Baldwin wrote to Angela Davis, where he says that Americans, quote, measure their safety in chains and corpses. Wow. So throughout the book, Andrew Krinks is talking about the ways that police and prisons are salvific.
Yep.
And that the control of policing and prisons is in service to white property.
Yes.
And white property is God ordained, and therefore policing and prisons are saving us and saving those things, and therefore there's a measure of salvation in them, or it's connected to that same kind of concept of salvation.
Absolutely.
And so in the chapter, he says, quote, police exist to use ordained violence to defeat and eliminate the enemies of all humankind. If the enemies that police fight are, by definition, beasts, monsters, and demons, then it follows that anyone whose life the police end must have been a beast, a monster, or a demon, which is to say, worthy of elimination. When it comes to acts of violence, including lethal violence against allegedly aggressive enemies, the police can only be innocent. They are, in fact, just doing their job, holding the line that protects what the state discerns as the good from what the state discerns as evil. If Michael Brown was a demon, then his death was not only justified, but an act of God, mortal and immortal alike. Indeed, putting to death those who constitute a demonic threat against sacred order, against the innocent who dwell within that order, is, for the religion of mass criminalization, a death that brings life, the sacrificial production of a corpse that makes safe. And so I wanted to share that passage in particular because it feels like it encapsulates some of the reactions I've seen and heard to when police kill people. There's always an assumption of guilt or wrongdoing of the person who was killed, or when there's a video, it's like we didn't see the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which is obviously, that line of thinking is flawed in and of itself, because it doesn't matter if they were doing something wrong. The police still should not kill them.
Right.
But the way Andrew puts this, I think, better illustrates how people are influenced, or how they're thinking, or how they're not even thinking, but they're just reacting because this is what we are trained to think, how we're trained to approach it.
Yes.
It's not just a belief in the police, but it's a notion that the police are ordained to mete out violence in order to protect white people and property and the social order.
Yes.
And ultimately, a few folks being killed unjustly in the service of that order is fine with people. And he further illustrates this point a little later in this chapter when he says, quote, "Most people today are so deeply devoted to cops and cages and would do anything to ensure their continued existence because the capitalist and colonial state has convinced us that without damnation to hell for those who deserve it, there can be no heavenly salvation for the rest of us. That without the salvation that cops and cages secure, we will all be damned."
Yeah.
And I think the combination of these two things and a lot of things in this chapter really brought things into focus for me of how we collectively, but also you and I, have seen reactions to people's deaths that were clearly unjust, right? Like the knee-jerk reaction to it is just steeped in all of this and the sacredness of policing and just the way that that's so deeply ingrained in us, and we don't notice it, we don't see it. It's just there. It's a thing, and that's I having read this now, I am like, oh, that's what all of this is. That's what the knee-jerk reaction is. That's what ultimately when people say fund the police, that they're reifying this belief in the sacredness of the police and the sort of God-ordained status that they hold as the protectors of the social order.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. I feel like I'm having a visceral reaction to what you talked about. And I remember having the same reaction when I read this chapter, because you're right. This chapter, like a few of the other chapters as well, but this chapter really like shot off some light bulbs for me, and like flipped on some light bulbs, light switches, whatever the term is. I'm having trouble here because, thinking about Michael Brown and thinking about all of the Black and brown people who have been murdered by the police unjustly. This analysis of why that is, and as you say, people's reaction to it. Yeah, this was a difficult one to get through, but it made it make sense in so many ways, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about this book and his analysis in it. Yeah, so thank you for bringing that. Mm-hmm. That was a really great part of this book. I'm glad we got to talk about it a little bit. One of the other things, there's so many things to talk about. Yeah. Chapter 2, I'm going to take us back there. That chapter was called Ownership of the Earth Forever and Ever, Amen. And this chapter really dives into the ways in which patriarchal whiteness and capitalism are religious phenomena, which really help us to understand why some of these concepts and systems are so baked into our society and so baked into all of us. Krinks says this, quote, "Whiteness and regimes of private ownership reorganize life, landscape, and ways of thinking, perceiving, and being embodied in so all-encompassing a way that they are best understood as religious phenomena in themselves, as opposed to simply social, political, or economic realities that just happen to be influenced by religious ideas at various points of their historical formation. Patriarchal whiteness and private ownership transform and reframe reality, imposing implicit and explicit demarcations of sacred and profane, pure and polluted, moral and immoral on real peoples and places. They make and impose those meanings, materializing them through systems of power, value, culture, and law. They build walled, gated, fenced, and psychic boundaries to keep their demarcations, simultaneously religious, political, social, economic, and cultural, and the larger social orders that they uphold in place. They provide a means for a few to obtain godlike power over the earth and its peoples. They soothe the anxieties of moral finitude by building mechanisms of exclusive transcendence and invulnerability that work only by exposing others to vulnerability and harm. They create access to life for some and vulnerability to premature death for so many others. They provide a path to heaven for a few by creating hell for many. They deify some by destroying others. Such determinations are not without breaks and disruptions forged by acts of refusal and reconstitution. And yet, because whiteness and property have contributed so profoundly to making the world as we know it, critical analysis of their functionally religious power, reach, and resilience is an indispensable step in breaking mass devotion to them and their power over our lives. And that is so powerful. And I think this entire book, that not just that chapter, everything in this book serves as a way to engage in that critical analysis and gives us a critical why for the work that's necessary to dismantle white supremacy in all of its forms.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this already tonight, but I think the book really illustrates just how deeply ingrained white supremacy is, along with religion, and it's just all so deeply embedded. And yeah, it's hard to pull apart what it will look like without it.
Yes.
Because even though we have ideas around what societies looked like prior to, it's hard to go back to that place.
Yes.
Because we've been in this place for so long.
So long.
And
yes.
Yeah. So he talks about abolition, and abolition ultimately becoming its own version of a faith.
Yes.
And I think that feels like a powerful way for him to talk about that. I think that was from the conclusion.
Yeah. Well, and especially in the context of, the topic of this book. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift. Let's talk about application.
Okay.
How does this, because I'm talking about some of the things that are part of my application.
I love it.
Or connected to, I don't know if, anyway, how does this book apply to our day-to-day lives and work? I've got 2 quotes from the conclusion that I think really bring this book and Krinks' arguments to life. The first is, quote, "Indeed, capturing and caging was never really meant to prevent all forms of harm or respond effectively to them. The function of police and prisons is not to keep us safe, but to manage the outcomes of inequality, which is why cops and cages cannot be reformed. They are working exactly as designed, doing their job in service of a deliberately inequitable system that is, for those who benefit from it, sacred and thus worthy of protection, no matter how much abandonment and violence it takes." Which is such a great summary of the purpose of police.
Yes.
In the context of the system as he tells us about.
Right.
And we talked about the enclosure of the commons. We talk about essentially the ways that people are deliberately left out of that economic system.
Yep.
And we think about it now when there is a basically full employment in our economic system in the United States is like 2 or 3% or something of unemployment, which means there's 2 or 3% who are still don't have a job. Right?
Exactly.
So ultimately, the system cannot actually support everybody.
Yep.
It's designed in this way. And, even beyond that, there are people who get left behind even though they, quote, have a job.
Yes.
And so all of this is to say policing and prisons are a way to protect that system.
Yeah.
And continue it.
And by all means, you ended that by saying no, or he ends that by saying, no matter how much abandonment and violence it takes, the by all means mentality there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And so he then goes on to shift into discussing abolition, because I think this whole book is a giant argument for abolition.
Yep.
Because we see the way that systems of mass criminalization were built upon the foundations of patriarchal white supremacy and ultimately cannot be separated from those things. And they can't be separated from the mass abandonment and violence that it takes to maintain them. And so he says, quote, "What kind of world exactly do abolitionists seek to build? To begin with, in contrast to the racial, capitalist, settler, colonial, and carceral world, abolition is the building of a world structured around abundance, reciprocity, collective care, and freedom. A world, in short, that guarantees that all people's basic life-sustaining needs are met, which is to say, a world in which humans, all creatures, and the natural world thrive." And I think that's such a beautiful vision because it flips the current order on its head.
Yes.
And he spends all of this time in the book explaining the ways that the current order exists and the way that religion is tied into it, and then flips that on its head to conclude the book of saying, there are other ways. The current system feels inescapable.
Yes.
But there are other ways, and we can figure that out.
Yeah. It feels unescapable because in a lot of ways it's all around us. It's everywhere. But Yeah, a very beautiful vision there in the conclusion. It was really hard to think about application and what to bring. I think because there, again, was just so much that I learned from this book. I think one of the biggest pieces of learning for me was, the religious underpinnings and through lines of religion in white supremacy and in our criminal punishment system. There's just so much history about that and analysis in this book about that I appreciated learning. And so I also pulled something from the conclusion of this book. Andrew says this, quote, "Central to my argument over the course of this book is that the mass criminalization of Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, and propertyless and dispossessed peoples of all races fulfills a religious, even pseudo-salvific function for those who benefit or think that they benefit from it. Contrary to predominant presumptions, however, the reality is that cops in cages do not keep us safe, which is to say, they cannot save us socially or spiritually. Indeed, more than failing to create safety, mass faith in the pseudo-saving power of the mortal god of police and prisons ultimately damns and endangers us all. In the end, despite what detractors say, abolition is an expression of the desire for more safety than our system of capture and caging offers, not less." And I just thought, I was like, that's brilliant. I could not have said that better myself. And, again, you talk about this book being an offering of, or he's offering abolition as a solution here. I thought, well, there it is. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's an expression for the desire for more safety.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't remember who I'm paraphrasing now. I think it might be Miriam Kaba, but I'm not sure. But her point was that abolitionists are concerned with everybody's safety all the time. And policing in prisons could never.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, great stuff. Well, let's talk about homework. What do we want to do to continue to learn and unlearn about this beyond our conversation today? I very briefly looked at the notes and just sort of skimmed through those.
Oh, wow.
Not much, a few pages.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of richness in the notes where he not only cites sources as you would expect, but adds additional context about why these sources connect to his argument. And I read a few things and was like, well, this is great, and makes me want to sort of go back through the book and click tap on all the links to see the citation and the source and the note context that he provides to that source. And within the notes themselves, there are a lot of great books and articles cited that I want to just look into and maybe add some things to the list. But he cites Ruth Wilson Gilmore a few times in the book. So I'm going to specifically say that I want to get into some of her work in some more detail sometime soon.
I love that.
Whether that's some interviews or she's written a few books or what have you. So next few months we'll have something from Ruth Wilson Gilmore on the podcast.
I love that. Very good. Well, I think this book is totally worth revisiting, right? Because as you said earlier, we only could scratch the surface, and we only did scratch the surface of all of the amazing analysis in this book. And so first things first, I just want to go back through and reread all of the highlighting that I did in this book. I also would love to just check out more of his work. I think this is his first book, but he's published several book chapters and articles and reports and op-eds. And so it would be great to check all of that out. And I also just want to see, and maybe this connects to your homework, I would love to explore more about this topic of religion and its connections to white supremacy and racial capitalism, to continue our learning and unlearning work that we got to do with this incredible book. And so I think that really just connects to some of what you were talking about there.
Yeah, absolutely. I expected Doctrine of Discovery to come up at some point in this. I don't think that it did, but that's a huge topic for settler colonialism in particular, that the Catholic Church influenced across the world. But more on that later, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great stuff. Great book. Great discussion.
Yes.
And Damien, you are up next time what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, thank you to New York Press and to Andrew Krinks for reaching out to us and offering this book to us. And we really enjoyed, as you could probably tell, and I hope you do listen, we really appreciated this book. So thank you again. For next week, looking ahead, I'm bringing a piece from In These Times to the table for us to talk about. The piece is called Black Palestinian Solidarity in Moments of Crisis and Beyond by Nashwa Bawab, and it was published in early October. And the byline description of this piece reads, "A year into Israel's war in Gaza, 4 activists working at the intersection of Black and Palestinian liberation discuss the genocide, the upcoming U.S. election, and the power of international solidarity." And so this piece is actually part of an interview and conversation with Iman Abdelhadi, who actually wrote a piece in These Times that we read a couple of months ago. Calvin John Smiley, who wrote the book Defund, Conversations Toward Abolition, which we read and talked about on the podcast a little bit ago. Sandra Tamari, who is an organizer and leader based in St. Louis and the executive director of the Adala Justice Project. And finally, James Birch, who directs the Anti-Police Terror Project in Oakland, California. And so, I was fascinated by the people. I was like, oh, look, we know them. Oh, look, we know them. But I haven't read any of the conversation at all, but I was intrigued by the folks in this conversation. And so I'm excited to read this piece and for us to get to talk about it next time.
Very cool. Yeah, that sounds great. Looking forward to that. Lots of cool people. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.